I've been in marketing for about 16, 17 years. I cut my teeth in marketing, working for a small accounting startup company. We actually sold software as a service. It wasn't called software as a service at that time, but it was a software as a service company selling into accounting firms and small businesses. So I've been with Convergent for about 11 years. We've gone through about 3 or 4 very large management changes, company ownership changes. So I kind of look at this as we had a stop and start of go-to-market strategy about 4 times. So I'm kind of used to the go-to-market. So just so I get an understanding of who's in the room, can I get a show of hands of who's kind of business owner, partner, CEO? Okay, cool. Anybody in marketing? Priyanka? All right. And then B2B? B2C? Cool. All right. So I'm going to start off with something that's not so fun. So CB Insights did a study a couple of months ago. They did 101 interviews of startup companies that failed. They found 2 things. Number 1, there's really no clear understanding of why each one of them failed. They're all pretty different. Number 2, those reasons for why they failed were really vast. The reason I bring this up is because if you look at 4 of the top 10 reasons are really go-to-market focused. No market need, pricing and costing issues, poor marketing, and ignoring customers. So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about today that help to drive a better go-to-market strategy. So what are the steps? Defining, knowing your audience. This is a key part. I mean, you're going to hear this over and over and over again. It's all about knowing your audience, understanding your audience, the markets, the buyer personas. It's also about knowing where they are. You have to know where they are in order to reach them, to market to them, to talk to them, to build a relationship with them. Defining your brand message. That's a really key aspect of this, is to kind of understand who you are and how that resonates with that target market. Establish a pricing strategy. This is a space where a lot of startups have some trouble, so we'll talk a little bit about pricing. And then knowing the cost of acquiring customers. That kind of goes hand in hand with pricing and the revenue, but knowing how much it costs you to acquire a customer is really important. It's amazing how many don't quite understand that. So let's get started with defining your audience. So when I think about defining your audience, I really think it's 2 steps, or it's 2 parts. Number 1 is market segments. Which market or market segments are you going after? And number 2, it's the buyers within those market segments that are really important to understand. So I'm going to start out with the first one, the market segments. A lot of startups find it really kind of challenging to identify the particular market segments that they're going after. You think that if you choose 1 or 2, you're really limiting the amount of customers that you can go after. But in fact, it's the opposite. You're really driving more opportunity for success by tightly defining those markets. Great news if you're a healthcare tech startup. That's a pretty easy answer. We're going right after the healthcare industry. That makes it a little bit easier. But there's still some additional segmentation in that. If you pick a particular market, like healthcare, it's, okay, so what part of healthcare, what size, what do they look like? The more granular you can get, the better. So quick tip, it's not about what you want, though. It's about who wants you. That's a really important piece. You look at the big, shiny market segment out there, that might be pretty intriguing, but that might not be the best fit. So understand what market you're best suited for, and go after that one. So we look at this a little bit and where to focus. So we've got 2 circles: what do customers want and what your brand does best. When we start to add the competition in that, it changes the complexity a little bit. So it develops a couple of different zones. We've got the losing zone. Essentially, you're trying to compete against what your competition or what your customers want and what your competition does best. It's a losing battle. You're not going to win that. The dumb zone, which I think is pretty fun. It's what your competition does best, what your brand does best, but your customers don't want that. So why compete in that space? The risk zone, I think, is important to understand. It's what you do best, it's what your customers want, but it's also what the competition does best. In order to succeed in that realm, you need innovation, you need speed to market, you need to be better, bigger, faster. For a startup, sometimes that can be a challenge. The best one is the win zone. What do customers want? What does your brand do best? And that's something outside of what the competition does. So that's a safe zone.
I was just curious. I noticed up to this point, it didn't seem like there was any mention about product or service. That just surprised me.
I figured at this point, so I've focused on those 5. I figured at this point the product is set, is baked. And understanding the kind of the features, benefits of that, and the why of that, and we'll discuss that in a little bit, and on the brand promise section. All right. So let's talk about the buyers within those segments. This is critical. Buyer personas. If you're a B2B company, you're still selling to rational human beings who buy with practicality, but also buy with emotion. If you're a B2C company, this is just as important. So establishing buyer personas, understanding who those buyers are, what their needs are, and it's understanding what their needs are beyond the product or service that you deliver. So retail is a target market for Convergent. Retailers are facing a number of challenges these days. It's important for us to know what those challenges are beyond just digital signage. They're having trouble getting people in store. Amazon is killing them. Those are all things that we need to consider when we go to market and go after retailers. So here's an example of a buyer persona that we developed for that retail segment. So we're going after the VP of marketing. We call him Sam. So it's really understanding Sam and the profile of who he is, what he does. That's a critical understanding. It allows you to kind of get in his head a little bit, understand his challenges, again, beyond what your product or service delivers. What's on his mind? That's a critical aspect of this as well. So in doing this, you start to be able to develop a style and a tone, and then you're able to start to kind of present, how you can position yourself in Sam's mind. How do you get buyer personas? How do you develop these? If you have current customers, that's your number one opportunity. If you don't have any customers, use your network, leverage your network. Go find people that you know or that other people know that you can talk to that look like your customers. Get to know them, understand what they need, what they want. That can be a great benefit. If you strike out there, LinkedIn is a pretty decent way to go. You can actually go out and kind of stalk some people and find, what their backgrounds are, what their interests are, and that can help kind of build a user profile as well. So once you've identified them, now it's a challenge to find them. So identifying the right markets. Again, going back to talking to your customers, understanding your customers, or going to your network and leveraging your network to find people that look like your customers. Where do they go? Market research is really important here as well. And if you have a particular segment or a particular buyer persona, do a lot of internet research and find out where they're going, what kind of associations they belong to. Understand the influencers in those markets. There are bloggers and YouTubers out there that are extremely influential in making purchasing decisions. Understand who those folks are. Reach out to them. Include them in your PR list. Also think about the mix that you want to use to go after those folks. It's pretty important to develop a mix that suits your budget and suits your requirements. So I just put kind of a quick list together here of the ways that you can reach that target audience. with different levels of return on investment, different levels of effort, and different levels of cost. So you look at search engine optimization, that's a great way to understand who you are and be able to jump up in search engine rankings. That's also a really long-term, a great long-term strategy to establish yourself and your brand. Down at the bottom, so these are in order of kind of ROI and payback. So some of the things at the bottom, social media marketing, a kind of a mid-range ROI tends to be high effort, but average to mid-cost. So determining the right mix of using these is important when you're going to market with your product or service. So let's talk about defining your brand message. This one's kind of fun. It's really taking into consideration, again, your target customer, knowing who they are, what they want, and defining the market. It's about understanding the brand promise or creating your brand promise and giving them a reason to believe. So we've already talked about target customer and market definition a little bit. So I want to jump into more of the brand promise. So the brand promise, it's the most compelling, emotional, rational benefit that your target customers will find. Has everybody heard of the golden circle? All right. I think it's a great it's a great analogy, and I think it suits this quite well. It's defining your why. Customers buy because of the why. Why do you do what you do? If you can establish that, you're going to put yourself ahead of a lot of your competitors. The what's not that important, the how isn't that important, but that why is a critical aspect of that. So once you define that, you need to give folks a reason to believe. Case studies work great. Testimonials work great.
Could you give a couple of examples of like whys that you've seen that are just really powerful and resonate?
Yeah, Tesla is a great example. So you think of what? Those are kind of the specs, the techs. Tesla makes a reliable car. They make one that's super fast and super efficient. The how? Well, they make those in great big factories. They make them green, and they make you feel good about driving it. The why? They want to create a much better driving experience.
So the why is the not always emotional, but it's the hook, so to speak, that allows your target customers to sit in and try on, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, there is an emotional element to that. I mean, I think people buy from Tesla, they buy from Apple because of kind of an emotional connection. Apple makes it much easier to do things. They're kind of changing the world with some of the hardware that they're designing and developing. So I think Tesla is a great example of that. You're not just buying a car, you're buying the why behind the car. They introduced their new 3 Series a couple of months ago. It's not going to go into production for years, yet they had hundreds of thousands of people standing in line with $1,000 checks for a down payment for this thing. That's all driven because of the why, which I think is really important. Southwest is a pretty cool example. So defining the brand promise, but then giving them reason to believe. So Southwest, it was a couple years ago, in the deep of the recession, fuel costs were super high. People weren't traveling as much. Airlines were, being crippled. Southwest was faced with a really tough decision. They'd always positioned themselves, and their why was all about providing great customer service and being a customer-driven company. The conflict was that they thought, we either charge people for bags and gain $450 million in new revenue as a result of that, or be true to our customers. You all know what the answer is. They were true to their customers, and they forwent bag fees. The cool thing is, in doing so, they kept those customers happy. They they didn't see that $450 million as a result of the bag fees, but their market share increased by 1%. Their load size increased by 5%. Those things combined increased their revenue by $800 million.
Are they wearing orange sneakers?
So I think this was a pretty cool campaign. In fact, we were at Adam and I were at a conference, and Roy Spence, who was Southwest's ad agency, he was giving this speech about how he convinced Southwest to do this, and they kind of threw up their hands at one point and said, $450 million, that's really hard for us to walk away from. And he said he jumped across the table and said, absolutely not. This is against what we do and what our brand is. So he was pretty proud to tell the story of how he helped them stay true to their brand, which resulted in revenue, but also really driving home who they are to their customers. So let's look at pricing. There are a lot of pricing considerations. Are you a premium brand? Are you a value brand? A broad audience versus a highly targeted audience. Broad audiences tend to be more sensitive on price. Tighter, highly targeted audiences, maybe a little bit less so. Methodology is thinking of a cost-based pricing system versus a market-based pricing system. So cost-based, I want to make sure that I have at least 40% margin in every deal that I do. Or marketplace, I know that I can charge X in the market because that's the going rate for that, and that could be 5 or 6 times what your cost is. I think one of the most important considerations here is that pricing your stuff too low is a really common misstep for startups. So understand, number one, what your cost basis is, but number two, it's really important to understand what the market's willing to bear. I think those are really important concepts to consider. So a couple of pricing strategies, maximization. If revenue growth is your real driver, leveraging a maximization strategy is the right way to go. So this is utilized by a lot of mid-market software as a service companies, where they try to get the most out of every single deal that they can, try to get the most revenue out of those deals. Penetration is another one. Just lowering your price to kind of smooth the adoption rate, to increase the adoption rate, and then slowly increasing that as you move forward. Skimming, starting with a high price, and then kind of systematically lowering that. So Apple is kind of known to do that, where they introduce their new phones every year, or soon to be every other year, and then they kind of repackage the other phones, their older phones, and then sell that to the lower market. So that's another example of a pricing strategy there. It's important, though, that once you choose your pricing strategy, you need to make sure that everything else aligns with that. Your sales, your marketing, product engineering, it's all driven around your price. So let's talk about cost of acquiring customers. So what is the cost of acquiring customers? It's all the sales and marketing associated with selling and reaching those folks. It's the total marketing campaign cost. It's wages associated with sales and marketing. Cost of sales and marketing tools and software. Any other professional services used, and other sales and marketing overhead. That sounds like a lot, but that's going to give you the most accurate number around cost of acquiring customers. So you add those up and you divide it by total customers acquired. Once you get to that point, you've got your cost of acquiring customers. Sounds cool, but it doesn't really mean a whole lot. Where it starts to add value is when you compare it to the lifetime value of a customer. Lifetime value is the total gross margin that you expect to gain from that customer, or to make from that customer over the life of the contract.
Kris, question.
Yep.
Are there any other as-a-service businesses here? Because I know Convergent is and our business is, but are there any others who are doing as-a-service?
What service?
as a service, selling essentially a seat as opposed to a product that's installed?
We're just getting,
Okay, because I don't want to go too deep into it if it's not beneficial to the rest of the audience, but one of the things I've been weighing is when you talk about the cost of acquisition, the support cost is part of what, in early startup, I'm looking at the support cost, which would normally be cost of goods. I'm almost looking at it as an acquisition cost initially because I have to overinvest while building up the number of customers. So I was just curious to see if you kind of ran into that either with early days, right, for Convergent, or with, business lines you may be introducing. Did you ever kind of flip that equation where you consider that to be an acquisition cost?
Yeah, I think it's an acquisition cost, and when you start to look at the relationship between the cost of acquiring customers and lifetime value, it's not going to start out in a favorable area. The goal is to kind of raise it up to a respectable area. But yeah, if your support costs are pretty high, that's part of a customer acquisition cost.
Yeah, well, in normal, when you do SaaS accounting, you would eventually flip it over to being cost of good.
Sure.
But, that's the kind of thing where I'm looking at the first year to 2 years, I'm thinking I'm going to have to be on the flip side where I can have to consider it, I have to invest as though it's a marketing sales type of, cost getting into the market, as opposed to a cost that's just a normal, kind of like hosting. Hosting is going to be higher initially when I don't have as many customers also.
You're right. You're right.
Are you looking at product bundling or sort of a matrix of related services so that you could accelerate additional revenue early on to kind of offset some of the acquisition costs?
Yes and no. I might do some services initially that will add on to the revenue and kind of embed them later. But initially, it's going to be a pretty common, pretty tight set of offerings. And, the volume of customers is really going to be the equation that has to
You
go.
look at drive scale.
Yes.
Is there a firm flag post between support versus paid for service?
It's kind of how many people can be supported, what's the critical mass? Because if the critical mass to staff is, say, 5 people, right? Because of hours, because of, vacations, that kind of thing. Then once I get to that crossover point, and I can see it in my financials where the crossover point is, where I've got enough volume of customers now that I can reasonably sustain that staff. Before that, I kind of have to overinvest in the staff. Does that make sense?
So I think the point is try to move up quickly into that relationship. So exactly. So if the benchmark is a 3-to-1 ratio. So 3 times the total lifetime value of a customer to the cost of actually acquiring one of those customers. If you're at a 4-to-1 ratio, you think you're doing great, it's actually time to really think about what you're doing and consider reinvesting more into marketing to try to drive more customers. In that 1-to-1 area, it's really kind of the danger zone. You're really not making any money. In fact, you're slowly losing money, and anything less than that is pretty risky. So how can we impact that? I think from a marketing standpoint, focusing on marketing efforts that are less expensive, social media, inbound marketing, some free trials. Those are things that can lower your cost of acquisition. When you start to add in high-priced salespeople, that can immediately throw up the cost of customer acquisition, which is pretty scary. So on the lifetime value side, reducing churn rates, increasing customer satisfaction, all of those obviously help to increase the lifetime value of your customer. Recurring revenue is a great model, and that can help you kind of stand tall as well. So I'm gonna finish with this slide. We talked a lot about target market. We talked a lot about buyer personas. This is a quote from Paul Graham, who's the co-founder of Y Combinator. These guys host bi-yearly a kind of a 3-month boot camp out in California where they bring in about 100 companies. They invest a little bit in them, but they bring them in and it's kind of like a Venture Atlanta, but it's on site. So they bring all of these folks in and they just try to help them prepare for their go to launch. And you can read this if you want, but it's all about understanding your users, understanding your customers. One of the points that he made was go to market early. The earlier you go to market, the earlier you can talk to your users, talk to your customers. Take every chance, take every opportunity to understand your users, who they are, what they do, what they think. That's such a critical component of this. So one of the things that I wanted to share with you as well is marketing tools. So marketing tools are always a consideration. Lots of people have lots of questions about marketing tools, and there are like millions and millions of them out there. It's hard to kind of distinguish some of them after a while. But GrowHack came up with a list. They interviewed a lot of startups and asked them, what are the top marketing tools that you use that you couldn't live without? And so we have everything from Hotjar to Ahrefs to MailChimp to some of the more expensive ones like HubSpot. But it kind of just gives you an understanding of some of those marketing tools, and they kind of break those down into kind of brand awareness, customer retention, kind of as the through the buyer journey. So, do you guys have any questions?
Fairly quickly, there was like a pricing slide.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go back to that? One more back, yeah. So I guess if you're using a model like that, it's important to, I see like kind of like that best value recommended,
Mm-hmm.
A lot when I see kind of structures like this. So do you have any feedback, I guess, on that as it's relating to pricing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can always kind of suggest where customers lie, and if given a choice, they tend to kind of focus in on that middle area. I think that's kind of an important thing to kind of guide them where you think it's best suited for them to be. Freemiums are also great too. I think a lot of the folks in the iTunes store have made a lot of money out of the freemium, where start out with a free product and then allow them to grow as they get bigger. So I think that's another strategy and tactic that you can use as well.
I've seen two reasons why best value would come up. One of them is that you kind of get to the optimal package, right? So the customer view is that they've crossed the threshold where they're willing to spend a bit more, but they're getting kind of almost everything that's in the higher levels. The real reason I would do it, in addition to that, though, because the market's going to recognize, but the customers are never going to know you have most of your, sales in that one lane or another. To me, that would be the best profit, right? I've got just that level of, I might have good profit in the lower two, but I've added just a little bit more, and I haven't really increased my cost, right? So the perception is that it's great value, but it's really actually my highest profit channel.
Could you maybe share a couple of scenarios where, despite this framework and effective planning, that things don't work out and left field innovation and disruption? A school of hard knocks or something.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a song sheet from our startup. Back a long time ago, when I was working at eledger.com. It was, we had a great product. There was nothing wrong with the product. It was a premium product. It was highly efficient. It was priced right. We understood the market really, really well. We understood the market segment really, really well. One of the things that we didn't take into consideration, it's understanding the user, and not understanding the user as good as we should have. We were coming out with a web-based, cloud-based accounting software package, and our target market was one of the most conservative groups that you could ever imagine, these accountants. There was no way that they were going to put their books in the cloud and really rely and trust upon that. That was a long time ago. That was 1999, 2000.
They still buy paper clips.
They do buy. They do. I mean, we were selling to folks whose customers came in with shoe boxes of receipts, and that's how they did their books. So you can plan, you can have everything ready to go, but sometimes that just doesn't work out. We ended up finding that there was a smaller segment within the accounting group who were focused on consulting, and these guys were kind of the trendsetters in that business. So we did find a lane to run in. We were able to run quite fast, but that was definitely a hard lesson learned.
Let's talk a little bit about B2C.
Mm-hmm.
B2C marketing and challenges about it. So we are in this space. The channels you listed out, pretty much we are into all of those emails, social media. The biggest challenge we see is the cost of marketing.
Mm-hmm.
So any thoughts, any tips as far as how do we control cost, or as a startup we don't have a lot of money from marketing perspective. So what can we do with a limited budget or low budget? Anything, any tips there?
Yeah, I would say focus on content, focus on PR, focus on some of those lower cost things that you can get a lot of traction from. The tools list that I shared with you at the end, that includes a lot of great tools that aren't that expensive. We talk about kind of the freemium. There are a lot of these tools out there where you can kind of get a glimpse into the product without having to spend a whole lot of money. Hotjar was a great example. You can get a free version of Hotjar that allows, so Hotjar you can get kind of a heat map of your website, see where people are clicking, see where their mouse goes. You can get a free version of that to get a better understanding. There are lots and lots of those. MailChimp, for example, I mean, you can get free MailChimp accounts with, as long as you stay under a certain threshold. So I think looking at the marketing tools and finding the best bang for your buck there is strong. But then things like social media, blogging, kind of posting your blog articles in other third-party resources is a great way to do that as well. So those are all things that you should take into consideration, but that content's a great start though.
If you were to consider the tools that are available, and the idea of using big data, and then the idea of a customer relationship for each and every person, a market of one,
Mm-hmm.
how does that notion map against, what is still kind of bread and butter traditional, market segmentation and execution?
Yeah, I think it's really kind of going back to that user and defining who that user is. It feels like a marketing to one, but it's really kind of, you're almost putting a blanket over that as well. I think that's really intriguing. That's one of the things that we're seeing a lot in our business. It's leveraging big data instead of retail to reach a particular person and promoting promotions, products, services right to them, right at the point of purchase. It is a little bit different than that, but it's almost like you're cheating. The way that Amazon does is allowing their past purchases, their past history to be able to drive that.
Orange and purple sneakers, they go together. if the two are walking side by side, that's what you say.
For sure. All right, anybody else? All right, thank you everybody. I appreciate it. Thanks for making the trip. Thanks for stopping by.